Art is never finished, only abandoned. An old man sits by the window of a French manor house, his right hand paralyzed, unable to paint. Outside, the Loire Valley stretches in gentle greens and blues, the kind of landscape he spent a lifetime trying to capture. He is surrounded by notebooks, thousands of pages covered in mirror writing, sketches of flying machines, anatomical studies, maps of waterways that don't exist yet. In the corner of the room sits a small wooden panel, a portrait of a woman with an enigmatic smile that he has carried with him for over a decade, still unfinished, still haunting him. This is 1519, and Leonardo da Vinci, the most celebrated artist in Europe, is dying. But here is what is remarkable. Even now, even with death approaching, his mind refuses to stop. He is still sketching, still observing, still asking questions about everything from the flight of birds to the nature of the human soul. Who was this man who could not be contained by any single discipline or definition? What kind of mind moves seamlessly from painting to engineering, from anatomy to architecture, from mathematics to music, without ever feeling confined by the boundaries of any single pursuit? The answer, as we will discover on this journey, lies not just in genius, but in an almost childlike refusal to accept the world as it appeared. Leonardo looked at everything as if seeing it for the first time. When he observed water flowing in a stream, he did not just see water. He saw spirals, vortices, mathematical patterns, the very essence of movement itself. When he dissected a human body, he did not just see muscles and bones. He saw machines, systems, the architecture of life. This insatiable curiosity, this need to understand the why behind every what, made him impossible to categorize. Was he an artist who happened to study science, or a scientist who happened to paint? The truth is, he was neither, and both. He was Leonardo, and there has never been anyone quite like him. Before we begin our journey through his extraordinary life, I would love it if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more than you might imagine. And I am genuinely curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. Now, let us travel back more than 5 centuries to a spring day in 1452, to a hillside in Tuscany where a child was born who would see the world differently than anyone before him. The date was April 15th, 1452. In a small hamlet called Anciano, nestled in the rolling hills near the town of Vinci, a baby boy came into the world at what the records call the 3rd hour of the night. His mother, Caterina, was a young peasant woman, probably in her early 20s. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a 25-year-old notary, a man of ambition and means, already building a successful legal practice. But Ser Piero and Caterina were not married. They would never marry. The child born that April, Knight was illegitimate, born outside the bonds of matrimony, and in 15th century Italy, this meant everything. Think about what this meant for a moment. In Renaissance Italy, your legitimacy determined your future. Legitimate sons could follow their fathers into professions, could inherit property, could join guilds, could attend university. Illegitimate sons, no matter how intelligent or talented, were locked out of these paths. Leonardo could never become a notary like his father. He could never study Latin and Greek at university. He could never enter the church or pursue law or medicine. The doors that opened easily for legitimate children remained firmly closed to him. And yet, this exclusion, this being cast to the margins of respectable society, may have been the greatest gift Leonardo ever received. because Leonardo, shut out from formal education, was left to his own devices. While other boys his age were memorizing Latin declensions and studying rhetoric, Leonardo was wandering the hills around Vinci, watching water cascade down rocky slopes, observing how light filtered through olive leaves, studying the flight patterns of birds. He was learning directly from nature itself, unmediated by books or teachers. He was developing what would become his most powerful tool, the ability to see. Not just to look, but to truly see. To observe with such intensity and focus that the world revealed its secrets. The landscape around Vinci was perfect for such an education. This was not the manicured countryside of modern Tuscany. This was wilder, more dramatic. Steep hillsides gave way to valleys where streams rushed and tumbled. Caves pocked the limestone cliffs. Forests of oak and chestnut covered the higher elevations. In the fields, farmers worked with tools that had changed little in centuries, their methods and education in practical mechanics. Leonardo absorbed it all. He watched how a plow turned earth, how a water wheel converted the energy of flowing water into motion, how birds adjusted their wings to catch different air currents. Every observation became a question. Every question led to more observations. His early years remain somewhat mysterious. We know that within a few months of Leonardo's birth, his father Ser Piero married a woman of his own class, a 16-year-old girl named Albiera di Giovanni Amadori. We know that Leonardo's mother Caterina was married off to a local man, a lime burner and farmer named Antonio di Piero Butti, with whom she would have 5 children. But where did young Leonardo live? The most likely scenario is that he spent his early years with his mother in Anciano, perhaps until he was about 5, and then was taken into his father's household in Vinci. This arrangement was not unusual for illegitimate children of well-to-do fathers. They were often raised by the father's family, given a home and food and basic care, but always reminded, subtly or not so subtly, that they were different, that they did not quite belong. Imagine being that child. You live in your father's house, but you are not quite his son, not in the way that matters. You bear his name, Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo from Vinci, but you will never inherit his profession or his status. Your stepmother is kind enough, perhaps, but you are a reminder of your father's youthful indiscretion. You exist in a strange liminal space, neither peasant nor professional, neither fully inside the family nor completely outside it. This sense of being an outsider, of not quite fitting in anywhere, would mark Leonardo for the rest of his life. But it also freed him. He owed no allegiance to tradition. He had no family profession to uphold. He could be whatever his mind and talent allowed him to become. In Vinci, Leonardo's education was minimal by the standards of his class. He learned to read and write in Italian, the vernacular, not the Latin that was the language of scholars and educated men. He learned basic mathematics, the kind needed for commerce and practical life. But he never mastered Latin as a child, and this lack would haunt him for years. When he later tried to educate himself, teaching himself Latin in his 30s, he would fill his notebooks with vocabulary lists and grammatical exercises, trying to catch up to the education he had been denied. Yet this lack of formal schooling meant that Leonardo approached knowledge differently than his educated contemporaries. He did not learn about the world through ancient texts and established authorities. He learned by doing, by experimenting, by seeing for himself. When other scholars would cite Aristotle or Galen, Leonardo would say, "Let me look for myself. Let me test this." Let me see if it is actually true. The person who most influenced Leonardo in these early years was probably his uncle Francesco, Ser Piero's younger brother. Francesco was different from his ambitious brother. He had no interest in the law or in making his fortune. He loved the land, the simple life of the countryside. He never married, and he seems to have taken young Leonardo under his wing, perhaps recognizing in the boy a kindred spirit. Together, they roamed the hills, and Francesco may have been the one who taught Leonardo to really observe, to pay attention to the small details that others overlooked. Years later, when Francesco died, he would leave his property to Leonardo, the only member of the family who had really understood him. By the time Leonardo was in his early teens, it was clear that he possessed unusual talent. He drew constantly, filling whatever scraps of paper or parchment he could find with studies of faces, hands, animals, plants. The quality of these drawings, even at such a young age, was remarkable. His father noticed, and Ser Piero, whatever his failings as a parent, was a practical man. He recognized that his illegitimate son would need a trade, and here was an obvious path. Leonardo could become an artist, not a painter of religious icons in some provincial town, but a real artist, trained in one of the great workshops of Florence. This was a career that did not require legitimacy or a university education. It required only talent and the ability to learn, and Leonardo had both in abundance. Ser Piero gathered some of his son's drawings and took them to Florence. The city was only about 20 miles from Vinci, but it might as well have been another world. This was Florence in the 1460s, the beating heart of the Renaissance, a city transformed by wealth and ambition and a passionate belief in human potential. The Medici family, bankers, and power brokers were the unofficial rulers, and under their patronage, Florence had become a showcase for art and architecture. Filippo Brunelleschi had completed his impossible dome over the cathedral. Donatello was creating sculptures that seemed to breathe with life. Fra Angelico's frescoes glowed with celestial light. And in dozens of workshops throughout the city, a new generation of artists was pushing the boundaries of what painting and sculpture could achieve. Ser Piero took his son's drawings to one of the most prestigious workshops in the city, that of Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio, whose name means true eye, was one of the leading artists of his generation, but more than that, he was a master of multiple crafts. His workshop produced not just paintings and sculptures, but also gold work, bronze casting, architectural designs, theatrical sets, anything that required skill and creativity. When Verrocchio looked at young Leonardo's drawings, he saw immediately what Ser Piero had seen. This was no ordinary talent. This boy had something special, a quality of observation, a delicacy of line, an understanding of form that could not be taught. He agreed to take Leonardo as an apprentice. And so, sometime around 1466, when Leonardo was about 14 years old, he left Vinci for Florence. He left behind the hills and streams of his childhood, the wild landscape that had been his first teacher. He entered a world of stone streets and tall buildings, of noise and crowds, of workshops that smelled of paint and plaster and hot metal. It must have been overwhelming. Vinci had perhaps a few thousand inhabitants. Florence had over 40,000. But Leonardo adapted, as he always would. He watched, he learned, he absorbed everything around him. The workshop became his new classroom, and he proved to be an extraordinary student. The apprenticeship system in Renaissance Italy was rigorous and comprehensive. An apprentice did not simply learn to paint, He learned everything required to run a successful workshop. Leonardo would have started with the most basic tasks: grinding pigments, preparing wooden panels, mixing plaster, cleaning brushes. Nothing glamorous, but essential skills that taught patience and precision. Pigments in those days were made from minerals, plants, even insects, and each had to be prepared differently. Azurite for blue, ground from copper ore. Vermilion for red, made from mercury and sulfur. The precious ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, worth more than gold. Leonardo learned the properties of each color, how they mixed, how they behaved when applied to different surfaces, how they changed over time. He learned to prepare surfaces for painting, a crucial skill. Wooden panels had to be carefully selected, joined, and prepared with multiple layers of gesso, a mixture of chalk and glue, each layer polished smooth before the next was applied. Canvas, which was just beginning to be used, required different preparation. Frescoes, painted directly onto wet plaster, demanded speed and precision, because once the plaster dried, corrections were nearly impossible. Leonardo learned all of this, and his perfectionism, his refusal to accept anything less than the best possible result, was evident even then. As he advanced in his training, Leonardo learned to draw, not casual sketching, but serious, disciplined study of form. Verrocchio's workshop followed the traditional method. Apprentices began by copying drawings by the master and other accomplished artists, learning the conventions of representing three-dimensional forms on a two-dimensional surface. Then they progressed to drawing from sculptures, which taught them about light and shadow, about how forms revealed themselves through the play of illumination. Finally, they drew from life, from models posed in the workshop, learning to see the infinite variety of human form and expression. Leonardo excelled at all of this, but he went further. He did not just learn the techniques, he questioned them, he experimented, he pushed beyond what his teachers showed him, always trying to understand not just how to draw something, but why it appeared the way it did. The workshop was a collaborative environment. Multiple projects were always underway simultaneously, and everyone contributed according to their skills. A painting commissioned from Verrocchio was rarely painted entirely by Verrocchio himself. He might design the composition, paint the most important figures or faces, but assistants and apprentices would paint backgrounds, drapery, less important figures. This was not considered deceptive. The workshop's name guaranteed the quality, regardless of which hands did the actual work. For Leonardo, this system was an education in itself. He saw how Verrocchio designed compositions, how he solved problems of perspective and proportion, how he made decisions about color and light. And he learned by doing, taking on larger and more important roles as his skills developed. There is a famous story about Leonardo and Verrocchio, one that has become part of the Leonardo legend. Verrocchio was working on a painting called The Baptism of Christ, commissioned for the Church of San Salvi. It was a traditional subject, showing John the Baptist pouring water over Christ's head, with angels attending and the Holy Spirit descending as a dove. Verrocchio asked Leonardo, still a young apprentice or perhaps a junior assistant, to paint one of the angels. Leonardo painted an angel in profile, holding Christ's garments, looking up with an expression of serene devotion. And according to the story, when Verrocchio saw what his young apprentice had done, he was so overwhelmed by the superiority of Leonardo's work that he put down his brushes and never painted again, devoting himself thereafter to sculpture. Like many such stories, this one is probably more myth than truth. Verrocchio did not stop painting after the baptism of Christ. but there is a grain of truth in the tale. If you look at the painting today, hanging in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, you can see the difference between Leonardo's angel and the rest of the painting. The angel Leonardo painted is softer, more alive, more real. The modeling of the face, the way light seems to glow from within the flesh, the delicacy of the curls, the sense that this is an actual being and not just a painted image. All of this marks it as something different, something new. The other angel, painted by Verrocchio himself or another assistant, is competent but conventional. Leonardo's angel seems to exist in a different reality, one more vivid and truthful than the painted world around it. This was Leonardo at perhaps 17 or 18 years old, already demonstrating the qualities that would make him legendary. But painting was only part of what Leonardo learned in Verrocchio's workshop. Remember, this was a place where multiple disciplines intersected. Verrocchio was working on a massive bronze sculpture, a monument to the military commander Bartolomeo Colleoni, and Leonardo would have been involved in all aspects of this project. He learned about bronze casting, one of the most technically demanding arts of the Renaissance. He learned about anatomy because to sculpt a convincing horse and rider, you had to understand how muscles and bones worked beneath the skin. He learned about engineering because creating a monumental bronze statue required solving complex problems of structure and weight and balance. He learned about mathematics and geometry, essential for working out proportions and perspectives. All of these skills, these different ways of understanding and shaping the world, were being absorbed simultaneously. Leonardo was not learning to be just a painter or just a sculptor. He was learning to be someone who could visualize ideas and make them real, regardless of the medium. Florence itself was an education. The city in the 1470s was at the height of its cultural power. Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, had taken control of the city, and under his leadership, Florence became a magnet for talent. Poets, philosophers, artists, scholars, they all gathered in Florence, drawn by Medici patronage and by the intellectual ferment of the city. In the Platonic Academy, founded by Lorenzo's grandfather Cosimo, scholars debated the ideas of Plato and the ancient world, trying to reconcile classical philosophy with Christian theology. In the churches and palaces, artists competed to create ever more impressive works. Everywhere you looked, people were pushing boundaries, questioning old assumptions, trying to recover the glory of the ancient world while creating something new. Leonardo absorbed all of this. He attended lectures and discussions. He made friends among the other young artists in the city, including Sandro Botticelli, Perugino, Lorenzo di Credi, Domenico Ghirlandaio. These men were his peers and his rivals, and from them he learned as much as from any master. They shared techniques, competed for commissions, criticized each other's work. It was an intense, competitive environment, but also a supportive one. They were all trying to solve the same problems, trying to figure out how to paint light, how to create convincing space, how to make painted figures look alive. Leonardo also developed interests outside of art. He began studying mathematics seriously, working through Euclid's elements, learning geometry and proportion. He became fascinated by optics, by the question of how the eye sees and how light behaves. He attended dissections, which were occasionally performed in Florence for the education of physicians and artists, and he began his lifelong study of human anatomy. Even as a young man, Leonardo could not be satisfied with surface appearances. He needed to know what lay beneath, how things worked, why they were the way they were. This drive to understand, to penetrate to the essence of things, was already becoming the defining characteristic of his mind. By his early 20s, Leonardo had completed his apprenticeship and been admitted to the Painters Guild, the Compagnia di San Luca. He was now a master in his own right, legally able to accept commissions and run his own workshop. But he did not leave Verrocchio immediately. He continued to work with his master for several more years, collaborating on projects, taking on his own commissions while maintaining the connection to the workshop that had trained him. This was a common practice. Young artists often stayed connected to their master's workshop even after achieving independence, both because it provided a steady stream of work and because the collaborative environment was creatively stimulating. Leonardo's first independent commissions show him already pushing beyond the conventions of his training. In 1478, he received a commission to paint an altarpiece for the chapel of the Palazzo Vecchio, the town hall of Florence. He never completed it. This would become a pattern. But he did produce a drawing for the project, a study of the hanging of Bernardo Bandini, one of the conspirators in the Pazzi conspiracy, a failed plot to overthrow the Medici that had resulted in the murder of Lorenzo's brother, Giuliano. Leonardo's drawing shows Bandini hanging from a window, his body limp, his face distorted. It is a brutal, unflinching image, but what is remarkable is the accompanying notes. Leonardo carefully recorded what Bandini was wearing, the color and style of his clothes, the position of his body. Even in documenting an execution, Leonardo was observing, analyzing, trying to understand exactly how a hanging body looked, how fabric draped on a lifeless form. Nothing escaped his attention. Nothing was too grim or too mundane to study. Another early work, The Annunciation, now in the Uffizi, shows Leonardo grappling with traditional religious subjects while already demonstrating his unique approach. The painting depicts the angel Gabriel announcing to the Virgin Mary that she will bear the Son of God. It is a subject painted thousands of times before, but Leonardo's version is different. The setting is more naturalistic, a walled garden with meticulously painted plants and flowers, each one botanically accurate. The perspective is carefully worked out, with the building behind Mary receding convincingly into space. The angel's wings are not the conventional golden decorations of earlier paintings, but are based on actual bird wings, with real feathers arranged in anatomically correct patterns. Mary's face is serene but thoughtful, as if she is actually considering what the angel is telling her, not just accepting it with pious submission. Everything in the painting shows Leonardo's refusal to simply accept tradition. He looked at the world, at real gardens and real birds and real human expressions, and he painted what he saw, not what convention dictated. But even as Leonardo was establishing himself in Florence, even as he was receiving commissions and building his reputation, there was a restlessness in him. Florence, for all its cultural richness, was also a place of intense rivalry and limited opportunities. There were many talented artists competing for commissions. The Medici had their favorites, and Leonardo, despite his obvious gifts, was not among them. Perhaps it was his outsider status, his illegitimacy, that prevented him from ever quite fitting into Florentine society. Perhaps it was something in his personality, a refusal to flatter or conform. Whatever the reason, Leonardo began to look beyond Florence, to imagine a different kind of future. In 1482, when he was 30 years old, Leonardo made a decision that would change his life. He left Florence for Milan. This was not a casual move. Milan was ruled by Ludovico Sforza, a man who had seized power and was determined to transform Milan into a cultural and political powerhouse to rival Florence. Ludovico, known as Il Moro, the Moor, because of his dark complexion, was ambitious, ruthless, and hungry for prestige. He wanted the best artists, the best scholars, the best engineers. Leonardo saw an opportunity. He wrote a letter to Ludovico, a letter that has become famous because it reveals so much about how Leonardo saw himself at this point in his life. The letter begins with Leonardo listing his skills as a military engineer. He can build portable bridges for armies. He can drain moats and construct siege equipment. He can design cannons and mortars and other weapons. He can build armored vehicles and warships. On and on, Leonardo lists his engineering capabilities, his ability to solve practical military problems. Only at the end of the letter, almost as an afterthought, does he mention that he can also paint and sculpt, and that if Ludovico wants someone to create a monumental bronze horse to honor his father, Leonardo can do that too. This letter is remarkable because it shows Leonardo rebranding himself. In Florence, he was known as a painter. In Milan, he wanted to be known as something more, an engineer, an inventor, a man who could solve any problem. Whether Leonardo actually possessed all the skills he claimed in the letter is debatable. Some historians think he was, exaggerating, presenting himself as more experienced than he really was. But what is clear is that Leonardo believed he could do these things, or could learn to do them. His confidence in his own abilities, his conviction that his mind could tackle any challenge, was absolute. Ludovico Sforza was impressed, or at least intrigued. He invited Leonardo to Milan, and Leonardo went, leaving behind Florence and beginning a new phase of his life. He would spend the next 17 years in Milan, the longest period he would spend in any single place. And it was in Milan that Leonardo would truly come into his own, not just as an artist, but as the universal genius that history remembers. Milan in the 1480s was very different from Florence. It was a larger city, more industrial, less refined. Where Florence prided itself on its republican traditions and its cultural sophistication, Milan was a military state, ruled by force, focused on power and expansion. Ludovico Sforza was not a legitimate ruler. He had seized power from his nephew, the rightful duke, and he maintained control through a combination of political cunning and military might. But Ludovico understood that power needed spectacle, that a ruler needed to appear not just strong, but also cultured and sophisticated. He wanted his court to be a center of learning and art, a place where the finest minds gathered. And so he collected talented people the way other rulers collected jewels. Leonardo thrived in this environment. In Florence, he had been one artist among many, competing for commissions, never quite achieving the status of a Botticelli or a Ghirlandaio. In Milan, he became Ludovico's favorite, his go-to person for any project that required creativity and technical skill. Ludovico gave Leonardo a workshop in the Corte Vecchia, the old court building, and a regular salary. For the first time in his life, Leonardo had financial security and the freedom to pursue his interests without constantly worrying about the next commission. The range of projects Leonardo worked on in Milan is astonishing. He designed sets and costumes for court festivals and theatrical performances, creating elaborate mechanical devices that amazed audiences. He painted portraits of Ludovico's mistresses and court favorites. He consulted on architectural projects, offering advice on everything from the design of the Milan Cathedral to the layout of the city's fortifications. He worked on plans for irrigation systems and canal networks. He designed weapons and defensive structures. And yes, he painted, though painting was only a small part of what he did. Leonardo in Milan was not primarily an artist. He was a court intellectual, a universal problem solver, someone Ludovico could turn to for anything that required intelligence and creativity. One of the first major projects Ludovico gave Leonardo was the one he had mentioned in his letter, the Great Bronze Horse. This was to be a monumental equestrian statue honoring Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza, who had been a famous condottiere, a mercenary commander before seizing control of Milan and founding the Sforza dynasty. Equestrian statues were prestigious commissions, symbols of power and permanence. The challenge was technical as well as artistic. Bronze statues of this size were extremely difficult to cast. You needed to create a perfect mold, pour molten bronze at exactly the right temperature, ensure even cooling, avoid air bubbles and cracks. The largest successful bronze horse ever created was Donatello's Gattamelata in Padua, and it had taken years of work and multiple attempts. Leonardo approached the project with characteristic ambition. He did not just want to match previous equestrian statues. He wanted to surpass them. He envisioned a horse 3 times life-size, rearing up on its hind legs, frozen in the moment of action. It would be the largest bronze sculpture ever created, a technical marvel that would proclaim to the world the greatness of both the Sforza family and the artist who created it. Leonardo began by studying horses with the same intensity he brought to everything. He went to the Sforza stables and drew the Duke's finest horses from every angle. He measured them, noting the proportions of their bodies, the shapes of their muscles, the way they moved. He dissected dead horses to understand their anatomy, to see how the skeleton and musculature worked together to produce the power and grace of these animals. His notebooks from this period are filled with horse studies, not just careful anatomical drawings, but also quick sketches capturing the essence of equine movement, horses rearing and galloping and standing at rest. Leonardo was doing what he always did, going beyond surface appearance to understand the underlying reality. He needed to know how horses actually worked, how their bodies were constructed, so that his statue would not just look like a horse, but would embody the truth of what a horse was. The technical challenges of the project were immense. A rearing horse meant that the entire weight of the statue would be balanced on the 2 hind legs and the tail. The structural engineering required to make this work in bronze was extraordinarily complex. Leonardo filled page after page of his notebooks with calculations and diagrams, working out how to distribute the weight, how thick the bronze would need to be at different points, how to create armatures and supports that would hold the molten bronze in place as it cooled. He consulted with bronze casters and foundry masters, learning everything he could about the process. For years, Leonardo worked on the horse. He created full-scale clay models, each one representing a new iteration of his ideas. He experimented with different poses, different proportions, and gradually, over time, his ambitions became more realistic. The rearing horse, he came to realize, was probably impossible with the technology available to him. The physics simply did not work. The weight was too great, the balance too precarious. Reluctantly, he modified his design, settling on a horse in a walking pose, still monumental in scale, but more achievable. By the early 1490s, he had created a full-size clay model, over 20 feet tall, that was put on display for the public. People came from all over northern Italy to see it, and they were awestruck. Even in clay, even incomplete, it was magnificent, a testament to Leonardo's understanding of equine anatomy and his sculptural skill. but the bronze horse would never be cast. Years passed, and Ludovico kept postponing the project, diverting resources to other priorities. Then, in the late 1490s, the political situation deteriorated. Milan was threatened by invasion, and Ludovico needed bronze not for statues, but for cannons. The metal that was supposed to immortalize his father was melted down to make weapons. Leonardo's clay model remained in place, a ghostly reminder of what might have been until 1499 when French troops invaded Milan. The soldiers used Leonardo's horse for target practice, destroying it with crossbow bolts and gunfire. All that remained were Leonardo's drawings and notes, thousands of pages documenting a project that consumed more than a decade of his life, but never reached completion. This pattern of grand ambition ending in abandonment or destruction would repeat throughout Leonardo's life. But it would be a mistake to see these unfinished projects as failures. For Leonardo, the process of investigation, of working through a problem, of deepening his understanding, was more important than the final product. The bronze horse taught him about anatomy, about materials, about engineering, about the limits of what was possible. Everything he learned went into the vast storehouse of knowledge he was accumulating, ready to be applied to the next challenge. While he was working on the horse, Leonardo was also pursuing what would become his lifelong passion, the study of human anatomy. This was dangerous territory. The Catholic Church had complicated and often contradictory attitudes toward the dissection of human bodies. Dissections were allowed for medical education, and Italian universities regularly performed them. But there was always a sense that there was something transgressive about cutting open a human body, something that violated the sanctity of God's creation. For an artist to perform dissections was even more questionable. Artists were not physicians. They had no official reason to be cutting up corpses. But Leonardo was compelled by a need to understand. How could he paint the human figure convincingly if he did not know what lay beneath the skin? How could he represent the body in motion if he did not understand how muscles and tendons and bones work together? He began attending dissections whenever he could, initially just observing as physicians worked, but gradually taking a more active role. He obtained permission through connections at hospitals and monasteries to dissect bodies himself. Over the course of his life, Leonardo would dissect more than 30 human bodies, a remarkable number for someone who was not a physician. His approach to anatomical study was revolutionary. Previous anatomical drawings had been schematic, symbolic, concerned more with labeling parts than with understanding how they functioned. Leonardo's anatomical drawings are something entirely different. They are precise, detailed, beautiful, and they reveal a mind trying to understand the body as a mechanical and biological system. He drew the skeleton from multiple angles, understanding how the bones articulated with each other. He traced the pathways of nerves and blood vessels. He opened the heart and tried to understand how it pumped blood through the body. He studied the eye, trying to figure out the mechanics of vision. He dissected pregnant women, documenting the development of the fetus in the womb. Nothing was off limits to his curiosity. His technique for anatomical illustration was also innovative. He developed a method of drawing the same structure from multiple viewpoints, showing it from the front, the side, from above and below, giving a three-dimensional understanding of complex forms. He made exploded view drawings, showing how different layers of muscle and tissue related to each other. He drew cross-sections, revealing internal structures. These techniques, now standard in anatomical illustration, were invented by Leonardo. he was not just documenting what he saw, he was finding new ways to visualize and communicate knowledge. The notebooks from his Milan period show a mind operating at an extraordinary level of intensity and breadth. On one page, he is working out the proportions of the human body, trying to understand the mathematical relationships that govern our form. On the next page, he is designing a flying machine, inspired by his study of bird, flight. Turn another page, and there are sketches for a submarine, or a design for a new type of lock for the Milanese canal system, or a drawing of a fetus in the womb. There is no distinction in Leonardo's mind between art and science, between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Everything is connected. Everything informs everything else. He became fascinated by water, by its movement and its power. He observed how water flowed in streams and rivers, how it formed vortices and eddies, how it eroded banks and carried sediment. He designed elaborate systems for controlling water, for irrigation and flood control, for powering mills and machinery. He recognized that water was one of the fundamental forces shaping the world, and he wanted to understand its principles. His drawings of water are astonishing, capturing with pure line the complex, turbulent patterns of flowing liquid. They are simultaneously scientific observations and works of art, proof that for Leonardo there was no boundary between the two. His mind was always making connections, always seeing patterns. When he studied the branching patterns of trees, he saw the same patterns in the branching of blood vessels in the body and in the delta of a river flowing into the sea. When he observed the spiral patterns in water, he saw the same spirals in the arrangement of leaves on a stem and in the curls of human hair. The universe, for Leonardo, was not a collection of separate phenomena, but a unified whole, governed by underlying principles that express themselves in infinite variations. Understanding these principles, uncovering the deep patterns that connected everything, this was what drove him. But Leonardo was also living in the world, navigating the complexities of court politics, managing his workshop, dealing with the practical realities of being an artist and engineer in Renaissance Italy. He was, by all accounts, a striking figure. Tall, physically strong, with a long beard and flowing hair, he dressed elegantly, often in bright colors, at a time when most scholars and serious men wore somber clothing. He was witty and charming, an entertaining conversationalist, skilled at debate and discussion. He played the lira da braccio, a stringed instrument, beautifully, and he sometimes accompanied himself while improvising songs and poetry. People were drawn to him, fascinated by his wide-ranging knowledge and his obvious brilliance. He gathered around him a group of students and assistants, young men who came to learn from the master. Some of them were talented artists who would go on to their own successful careers. Others were more companions than students, young men Leonardo seems to have taken in, partly out of affection or attraction. Leonardo never married, and there is considerable evidence that he was attracted to men, though the exact nature of his relationships remains uncertain and debated. What is clear is that he formed intense emotional bonds with some of his male students, particularly a young man named Gian Giacomo Caprotti, who entered Leonardo's household in 1490 when he was about 10 years old. Caprotti was, by all accounts, beautiful and utterly undisciplined. Leonardo nicknamed him Salai, which means little devil, and the name was apt. Salai stole from Leonardo, lied constantly, destroyed or sold his master's possessions, and caused chaos wherever he went. Leonardo's notebooks contain exasperated lists of Salai's misdeeds, along with rueful notes about money spent replacing things Salai had stolen or broken. Yet Leonardo kept him in his household for more than 25 years, provided for him, even made him an heir in his will. Whatever their relationship was, whether it was paternal, romantic, some combination of both, it was clearly one of the most important relationships of Leonardo's life. Salai appears again and again in Leonardo's drawings, his face becoming one of the most recognizable in Leonardo's work, the model for angels and saints and beautiful youths. In the midst of all this activity, all these varied projects and studies and relationships, Leonardo received a commission that would result in his most famous painting. Not the Mona Lisa, not yet, but the work that would establish him as the greatest painter of his age, The Last Supper. The commission came from Ludovico Sforza, but the painting was not for Ludovico's palace. It was for the refectory, the dining hall, of the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. The Dominican friars who lived there ate their meals in this hall, and it was traditional to decorate the walls of such spaces with religious images, usually a scene of the crucifixion or the Last Supper. Leonardo received the commission around 1495, and he approached it as he approached everything, by rethinking it from first principles. The Last Supper had been painted countless times before. The traditional composition showed Christ and the 12 apostles seated at a table, usually with Christ in the center, and the apostles arranged symmetrically on either side. Judas, the betrayer, was often placed on the opposite side of the table from the others, clearly marked as different. It was a static, formal composition, meant to inspire piety and contemplation. Leonardo looked at this tradition and decided to do something completely different. He imagined the Last Supper as a moment of intense drama. Christ has just announced that one of his followers will betray him. The apostles react with shock, confusion, anger, denial. Some lean toward Christ, demanding to know who the traitor is. Others pull back in horror. Still others argue among themselves. The whole composition is alive with movement and emotion. And Judas is not separated from the others. He sits among them, clutching the bag of silver coins he has been paid for his betrayal, his face in shadow, pulling back from the light that seems to emanate from Christ. You can identify him not because he is segregated, but because of his body language, his psychological state made visible through gesture and expression. Leonardo spent months just planning the composition, working out the arrangement of the figures, the gestures and expressions of each apostle. He filled his notebooks with studies of heads and hands, trying to capture exactly the right expression for each character. He went into the streets of Milan looking for faces, following people who had interesting features, studying them, trying to find real human beings who could serve as models for his painted figures. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that he had particular trouble finding a face for Judas. He needed someone who looked capable of betrayal, someone whose face revealed a corrupted soul. Finally, he found his model in a prison, a convicted criminal whose features had the hardness and cruelty Leonardo was looking for. The execution of the painting was as innovative as its conception. Leonardo was painting on a wall, but he did not use the traditional fresco technique, which required working on wet plaster and painting quickly before it dried. Fresco did not allow for the kind of subtle gradations of tone and color that Leonardo wanted. He needed to be able to work slowly, to revise and perfect every detail. So he experimented with a new technique, painting in tempera on a dry wall that he had prepared with multiple layers of gesso and other materials. This gave him the control he wanted, but it also meant the painting was more fragile, more susceptible to damage from moisture and temperature changes. Leonardo worked on the Last Supper for about 3 years, from 1495 to 1498, and he worked unlike any painter before him. He did not show up at the monastery every day and paint for regular hours. Sometimes he would work all day, climbing the scaffolding first thing in the morning and not coming down until evening, painting stroke after stroke with intense focus. Other times, days would pass without him appearing. Then he would arrive suddenly, stare at the painting for a few hours without touching a brush, make a single change to one figure, and leave. The monks who commissioned the work became frustrated. They wanted the painting finished. They complained to Ludovico, but Leonardo could not be rushed. He was thinking, observing, waiting for the moment when he knew exactly what needed to be done. There is a wonderful story, recorded by one of Leonardo's biographers, about the prior of Santa Maria delle Grazie complaining to Ludovico about Leonardo's slow progress. Ludovico summoned Leonardo and asked why the work was taking so long. Leonardo explained that he was having difficulty with 2 figures. He had not yet found the right face for Christ, which needed to embody divine wisdom and compassion. And he still was not satisfied with his conception of Judas. But, he added with a smile, if the prior continued to pressure him, he might just use the prior's face for Judas. Ludovico was apparently amused and told the prior to leave Leonardo alone. When the Last Supper was finally revealed, it caused a sensation. Here was a religious painting unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It was not an icon to be venerated. It was a narrative, a moment of human drama, painted with such psychological insight and technical skill that viewers felt they were witnessing the actual event. The perspective was perfect, creating a convincing illusion that the painted room was an extension of the real refectory. The figures were monumentally scaled, but also intimately human, each one a distinct individual with their own personality and emotional response. And the whole composition was unified by Leonardo's revolutionary use of light and shadow, his sfumato technique that softened edges and created an atmospheric quality, making the painted figures seem to exist in real space, breathing real air. The painting was immediately recognized as a masterpiece, but even as it was being celebrated, it was also beginning to deteriorate. Leonardo's experimental technique did not hold up well to the humid environment of the refectory. Within a few decades, the paint was flaking and fading. Over the centuries, the painting would be damaged by floods, by well-meaning but incompetent restoration attempts, by soldiers who used the refectory as a stable and who threw rocks at the painting for amusement. A doorway was cut through the wall, destroying Christ's feet. By the 20th century, large portions of the painting had been lost or obscured. What we see today, even after recent restoration efforts, is a ghost of what Leonardo created. But even in its damaged state, even with so much of the original paint gone, the power of the composition is still evident. The Last Supper remains one of the most influential paintings ever created, copied and imitated countless times. Its central image, Christ with his arms outstretched, surrounded by his shocked disciples, burned into our collective cultural memory. While he was working on the Last Supper, Leonardo continued his other studies and projects. His notebooks from the late 1490s show him thinking about an extraordinary range of subjects. He was designing machines, weapons, fortifications. He was studying optics and acoustics, trying to understand how light and sound behave. He was investigating geology, theorizing about the formation of mountains and the slow processes that shaped the Earth's surface. He found fossils of marine creatures high in the mountains and correctly deduced that these areas had once been underwater, a revolutionary idea at a time when most people believed the Earth was only a few thousand years old and unchanging. He was learning to speak Latin, filling his notebooks with vocabulary and grammar exercises, trying to educate himself in the language of scholarship. He was reading voraciously, everything he could find on mathematics, natural philosophy, engineering, history. His curiosity was truly universal. Nothing was too grand or too trivial for his attention. He studied the flight of birds with the goal of understanding the principles that would allow humans to fly. He designed flying machines, elaborate contraptions with wings modeled on bat wings or bird wings, with the pilot lying horizontal and operating the wings through a system of levers and pedals. Did Leonardo ever actually build any of these flying machines? Did he or anyone in his workshop ever attempt to fly? The evidence is unclear, and most historians think probably not. The technology to build a working human-powered flying machine simply did not exist in Leonardo's time. But that did not stop him from trying to solve the problem theoretically, from working out the principles, even if practical application was beyond reach. He also studied less exalted subjects. He was fascinated by jokes and riddles and visual puzzles. His notebooks contain long lists of puns and jokes, many of them bawdy or scatological, the kind of humor that would have been popular at court. He drew grotesque heads, caricatures of ugly people with exaggerated features, finding as much interest in the extremes of human unattractiveness as in ideal beauty. He loved music and spent considerable time designing new musical instruments, including a kind of keyboard instrument that would produce a continuous sound like a violin or an organ. He thought deeply about the relationship between mathematics and beauty, trying to discover the mathematical proportions that made something pleasing to the eye. Everything connected. His study of anatomy informed his painting, giving him an understanding of how bodies moved and how to represent them convincingly. His study of optics helped him understand how light behaved, leading to new painting techniques. His engineering work taught him about forces and structures, knowledge he could apply to architecture or to understanding the mechanics of the human body. His notebooks are not organized by subject, because for Leonardo, there were no separate subjects. There was only the world, infinitely complex and interconnected, and his attempt to understand it. But the late 1490s also brought increasing political instability to Milan. Ludovico Sforza's hold on power was weakening. He had made too many enemies, and the complex web of alliances that kept the Italian city-states in balance was unraveling. France, under King Charles VIII, and then Louis de Victorin, had ambitions in Italy, claiming various territories including Milan. In 1499, French armies invaded northern Italy. Ludovico tried to resist, but was outmaneuvered militarily and politically. He fled Milan, and the French took control of the city. Leonardo found himself in a precarious position. He had been Ludovico's man, supported by Ludovico's patronage. Now Ludovico was gone, and Leonardo had no clear role in French-controlled Milan. For a few months, he stayed in the city, uncertain what to do. Then, in December of 1499, he left Milan, taking with him his notebooks, his drawings, some of his possessions, and several members of his household, including Salai. He was 47 years old, at the height of his powers, with a reputation as the greatest painter in Italy, but he was also essentially homeless and unemployed, leaving behind most of his unfinished projects, including the remains of the Great Bronze Horse. Leonardo traveled first to Mantua, where he was hosted by Isabella d'Este, one of the great art patrons of the age. Isabella desperately wanted Leonardo to paint her portrait, and he did create a drawing, a beautiful profile study that captured her elegance and intelligence. But he never painted the final portrait, despite Isabella's repeated requests over the following years. From Mantua, Leonardo moved to Venice, where he stayed for a few months, working as a military engineer, inspecting the city's defenses and proposing improvements. But Venice did not feel right to him either, and by April of 1500, he was back in Florence, the city he had left 18 years earlier. Florence had changed in Leonardo's absence, and so had he. The city was no longer ruled by the Medici. Lorenzo the Magnificent had died in 1492, and his son Piero had been driven out 2 years later. Florence was now a republic again, though a fragile one, still recovering from the trauma of Savonarola, the fire and brimstone preacher who had briefly dominated the city in the mid-1490s, denouncing wealth and art and secular learning, organizing the famous bonfire of the Vanities, where Florentines burned their books and paintings and finery. Savonarola himself had been executed in 1498, burned at the stake in the Piazza della Signoria, but his influence lingered. Leonardo returned to a Florence that was artistically vibrant, but politically uncertain, and he was no longer the promising young artist who had left for Milan. He was now a mature master, famous, respected, but also known as someone who did not finish projects. His reputation was complex. Everyone acknowledged his genius, but there was also a sense that he was unreliable, that commissioning work from Leonardo was a risky proposition because you might never actually receive the finished product. Still, he quickly received commissions. The Servite monks of Santissima Annunziata offered him a workshop and wanted him to paint an altarpiece for their church. Leonardo began work on a cartoon, a full-scale preparatory drawing, of the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne. When he put this cartoon on display, it caused a sensation. According to contemporary accounts, people lined up for days to see it, marveling at the revolutionary composition. Leonardo had arranged the figures in a pyramidal grouping, with Saint Anne at the back, the Virgin Mary sitting on her lap, and the infant Christ reaching toward a lamb. The figures seemed to flow into one another, connected by gesture and glance, creating a sense of movement and interaction, unlike anything in previous religious painting. The faces were rendered with Leonardo's characteristic sfumato, the features emerging from soft shadows, impossibly alive and human. But once again, Leonardo did not complete the painting. The cartoon was magnificent, but a cartoon was not what the monks had commissioned. They wanted a finished altarpiece for their church. Leonardo, as usual, became distracted by other projects, other interests. The painting would eventually be completed years later, but not for the Servite monks. The version now in the Louvre was probably painted much later, and perhaps not entirely by Leonardo's own hand. What the monks got for their patronage was essentially nothing. This kind of behavior did not win Leonardo friends among potential patrons. In 1502, Leonardo entered into one of the strangest episodes of his life. He left Florence to work for Cesare Borgia, one of the most feared and hated men in Italy. Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, and he was engaged in a brutal campaign to conquer central Italy, creating a personal kingdom through a combination of military force, treachery, and political manipulation. He was the model for Machiavelli's The Prince, a man utterly without scruples, willing to do anything to achieve power. Why Leonardo agreed to work for such a man is unclear. Perhaps he was attracted by the intellectual challenge of military engineering. Perhaps he needed the money and the security of a steady position. Perhaps, as some have suggested, he had met Borgia and been fascinated by him, seeing in this ruthless and intelligent man a kind of force of nature worth studying. Leonardo spent about a year traveling with Borgia's army, serving as his chief military engineer. He inspected fortifications, designed defensive systems, created maps of territories Borgia controlled or planned to conquer. Some of these maps are astonishingly modern, using perspective and shading to show topography, far more sophisticated than anything being produced by professional cartographers of the time. Leonardo's map of Imola, a town in central Italy, looks like a modern aerial survey, accurate and detailed, a tool of war and administration. During this period, Leonardo would have witnessed the violence and brutality of Borgia's campaigns. He would have seen cities conquered, enemies executed, populations terrorized. How did he reconcile his work for such a man with his own values? His notebooks from this period say nothing about the moral dimension of his employment. They are filled with technical drawings and observations, as if he had decided to treat the whole experience as simply another opportunity to learn and observe. When Borgia's fortunes turned, when his father the Pope died and his enemies began to close in, Leonardo left his service and returned to Florence. By 1503, he was back in the city, once again looking for work, and he received a major commission, one that should have resulted in one of his greatest masterpieces, but instead became another in his long list of failures and frustrations. The commission was for a massive mural in the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of Florence's Republican government. The room was the Sala del Gran Consiglio, the hall of the Great Council, where the 500 members of Florence's governing body met. 2 walls of this enormous room were to be decorated with scenes of Florentine military victories. Leonardo was commissioned to paint the Battle of Anghiari, commemorating a Florentine victory over Milanese forces in 1440. The other wall would be painted by Michelangelo Buonarroti, depicting the Battle of Cassina. This was set up as a direct competition between the 2 greatest artists in Florence, and it immediately became one of the most anticipated artistic events of the age. Leonardo and Michelangelo were in many ways opposites. Leonardo was in his 50s, courtly, elegant, known for his scientific interests and his perfectionism. Michelangelo was in his 20s, rough, temperamental, utterly focused on art, contemptuous of Leonardo's failure to finish projects. The 2 men apparently disliked each other intensely. There are accounts of them exchanging insults in public. Michelangelo mocking Leonardo's abandoned bronze horse, Leonardo dismissing Michelangelo's muscular figures as anatomically incorrect. Both artists created cartoons for their respective murals, and both cartoons were considered masterpieces. Leonardo's depicted the central moment of the battle, a furious struggle for a standard, with horses and men tangled together in violent chaos. It was the most dynamic composition Leonardo ever created, all movement and energy, a study in conflict and aggression. Michelangelo's cartoon showed Florentine soldiers surprised while bathing, scrambling to dress and arm themselves in response to an alarm. It was an opportunity for Michelangelo to display his unparalleled skill at depicting the nude male body in action. Young artists flocked to see both cartoons, studying them, copying them, learning from these 2 masters. But neither mural was ever completed. Michelangelo was called to Rome by the Pope and abandoned the project. Leonardo began painting his mural but ran into technical problems. He was again experimenting with materials, trying to use an ancient encaustic technique mentioned in classical texts, involving pigments mixed with wax. The results were disastrous. The paint would not dry properly. Colors ran and blurred. Leonardo tried to fix the problems by applying heat, but this only made things worse. After months of struggle, he abandoned the project. What he had completed was covered over by later renovations. Today, nothing remains of the Battle of Anghiari, except copies made by other artists and Leonardo's own preparatory drawings. But even in these copies, you can see the power of Leonardo's conception, the writhing mass of men and horses, the expressions of fury and fear, the sense of absolute chaos that is somehow also absolutely controlled and composed. It was during these years back in Florence, in the midst of the Battle of Anghiari project, that Leonardo began work on the painting that would become the most famous image in the history of art, the Mona Lisa. The painting is so familiar, so reproduced and parodied and commercialized, that it is hard to see it clearly, hard to understand what makes it extraordinary. But if you can look past the familiarity, if you can try to see it fresh, the Mona Lisa is a revolutionary work, the culmination of everything Leonardo had learned about painting. The subject was Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. The commission was probably arranged in 1503 or 1504. It was, on the surface, a straightforward portrait, the kind of work Leonardo had done many times before. A wealthy merchant wants a portrait of his wife. Nothing unusual, but Leonardo saw, in this ordinary commission, an opportunity to create something unprecedented. He posed Lisa in front of a distant landscape, a technique he had used before, but here the landscape is not just a backdrop. It is an active part of the painting, a strange, dreamlike terrain of winding rivers and rocky peaks, atmospheric and ambiguous. The woman and the landscape seem to belong to the same reality, both emerging from the same soft, misty light. Lisa herself is painted with Leonardo's full technical mastery. Her face is rendered with such subtle gradations of tone that there are no visible lines or edges. Features emerge from shadow, the famous enigmatic smile hovering on her lips, her eyes seeming to follow the viewer. She is utterly present and yet also somehow distant, self-contained, unknowable. Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa very slowly, working on it intermittently over several years. He carried the painting with him when he left Florence, continued working on it in Milan, then in Rome, finally in France. He never delivered it to the merchant who had commissioned it. He never considered it finished. Even on his deathbed, the Mona Lisa was there, still incomplete in his eyes, still capable of being improved. What was Leonardo doing with this painting? What was he trying to achieve that required so many years, so much effort? Part of the answer lies in his perfectionism, his inability to accept anything less than absolute rightness. But there is more to it than that. The Mona Lisa was Leonardo's laboratory, the place where he could experiment with everything he had learned. Every insight about light and shadow, about atmospheric perspective, about human anatomy and psychology, about the relationship between figure and landscape, all of it went into this single painting. He was trying to create not just a likeness of Lisa Gherardini, but a painting that captured something essential about human existence, about consciousness and presence and the mystery of individual being. The Mona Lisa is not a window onto a specific woman at a specific moment. It is an encounter with subjectivity itself, with the experience of being looked at by another consciousness. That is why the painting has such power. That is why people stand in front of it, sometimes for hours, trying to understand what it is about this image that feels so alive. While Leonardo was working on the Mona Lisa, while he was struggling with the Battle of Anghiari, while he was receiving and abandoning various commissions, his mind was also racing ahead into territories that had nothing to do with painting. His notebooks from the first decade of the 16th century show him thinking about flight, about mechanics, about the nature of light, about geology and botany and astronomy. He was designing war machines, including a kind of armored vehicle that anticipated the tank by 4 centuries. He was sketching submarines and diving equipment. He was drawing parachutes and helicopters, or at least the Renaissance equivalent, devices that used spiraling screws to achieve lift. Did he understand that none of these inventions could actually work with the materials and power sources available to him? Probably. But that did not stop him from thinking about them, from working out the principles that might someday make them possible. He was also thinking about the human body in increasingly sophisticated ways. He dissected an old man who died in the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence and traced the blood vessels in his body, trying to understand what had caused his death. He concluded that the man had died from a narrowing and hardening of the blood vessels, describing what we now call atherosclerosis centuries before it would be recognized by medical science. He studied the eye with obsessive focus, dissecting eyes, trying to understand the optics of vision, how light entering the eye was transformed into sight. He made detailed drawings of the eye, more accurate than anything in contemporary medical texts. His curiosity extended to the earth itself. He climbed into the hills around Florence and studied rock formations, noting the layers of sediment, the presence of fossils. He developed a theory of the Earth's history, recognizing that the planet was far older than biblical chronology suggested, that it had been shaped by slow processes over vast stretches of time. He saw in the erosion patterns of rivers and the deposition of sediments the same principles that govern the growth and decay of living organisms. The Earth was alive, in a sense, a dynamic system constantly changing and evolving. But despite all this intellectual activity, despite the Mona Lisa and the notebooks filled with discoveries and inventions, Leonardo's position in Florence remained uncertain. He was famous, but not particularly successful in practical terms. Commissions came and went, most of them unfinished. He was not wealthy. He relied on the support of friends and occasional patrons. And he was growing older, now in his 50s, aware that time was passing and that for all his knowledge and all his genius, he had relatively little to show for it in terms of completed work. In 1506, he received an invitation to return to Milan. The French now controlled the city, and the French governor, Charles d'Amboise, was a great admirer of Leonardo's work. D'Amboise offered Leonardo a position as court painter and engineer, with a generous salary and the freedom to work on whatever interested him. Leonardo accepted, leaving Florence once again, leaving the Mona Lisa unfinished, leaving various commissions in limbo. He would never return to Florence to live. The city where he had learned his trade, where he had first achieved fame, was behind him now. Back in Milan, Leonardo entered into a period of relative stability. The French appreciated him in a way that Italian patrons often had not. They did not pressure him to finish projects. They valued him for his presence, his conversation, his ideas, as much as for any paintings or sculptures he might produce. Leonardo responded by plunging into new studies. He became interested in geology, in the formation of mountains, in the nature of fossils. He studied botany, drawing plants with scientific precision, noting the patterns of growth, the arrangement of leaves, the structure of flowers. He returned to his anatomical studies with renewed energy, dissecting more bodies, making ever more detailed drawings. His anatomical work from this period is astounding. He drew the muscles of the shoulder from multiple angles, showing how they attach to bone, how they work together to produce movement. He drew the heart with unprecedented accuracy, understanding its chambers and valves, trying to work out how blood flowed through it. He drew the fetus in the womb, showing its position, the placenta, the umbilical cord, with a delicacy and beauty that makes these scientific drawings works of art. He was far ahead of his time. His anatomical discoveries would not be matched by professional anatomists for centuries. But because he never published his findings, because his notebooks remained private, his anatomical work had no impact on the development of medical science. It was a private investigation, pursued for its own sake, because Leonardo had to know, had to understand. In 1513, Leonardo left Milan again, this time for Rome. A new pope, Leo X, had been elected, a member of the Medici family, and there was hope that this would mean major artistic commissions. Leonardo arrived in Rome full of anticipation, but he quickly found that Rome was not receptive to his particular genius. The Pope was more interested in Michelangelo and Raphael, both of whom were working on major projects in the Vatican. Leonardo, at 61, was seen as old-fashioned, too slow, too interested in science and theory to be relied on for the kind of large-scale projects the papal court demanded. He was given a workshop in the Belvedere Palace and a small allowance, but no major commissions came his way. Leonardo spent 3 frustrating years in Rome, increasingly marginalized, increasingly aware that the art world was moving on without him. He occupied himself with small projects, with experiments, with studies. He became interested in mirrors and lenses, in optics and the behavior of light. He designed elaborate mechanisms for reflecting and focusing light. He continued his anatomical work, though this got him into trouble. There were accusations that his dissections violated church law, that he was engaging in necromancy or other forbidden practices. Nothing came of these accusations, but they added to his sense of isolation. He was also aware of his own declining powers. His right hand, his painting hand, was becoming weak and unreliable. Some scholars think he may have suffered a stroke or developed some kind of nerve damage. He could still write and draw with his left hand. His notebooks show no diminishment of mental acuity, but painting, which required the fine motor control of the right hand, was becoming difficult. The man who had created some of the most technically perfect paintings in history was losing the physical ability to paint. In 1516, an offer came that would determine the final years of Leonardo's life. King Francis I of France, a young monarch who had just come to power and who was determined to make his court a center of Renaissance culture, invited Leonardo to come to France. The offer was extraordinarily generous. Leonardo would receive a title, a pension, a manor house, and absolutely no obligations except to be present, to talk with the king, to share his wisdom and experience. Francis did not want paintings or sculptures or engineering projects, though he would welcome them if Leonardo chose to produce them. He wanted Leonardo himself, the living embodiment of Renaissance genius, as an ornament to his court. Leonardo accepted. At 64, he left Italy forever, traveling over the Alps to France. He took with him his faithful companion, Salai, a few other members of his household, and several of his most precious possessions, including the Mona Lisa. He settled in the manor house of Clos-Lucé in the Loire Valley, near the royal chateau of Amboise, where Francis held court. And there, in this comfortable exile, Leonardo spent his final years. The relationship between Leonardo and Francis is one of the more touching aspects of Leonardo's life. Francis, 30 years younger, treated Leonardo with profound respect and affection. He visited Leonardo regularly, spending hours in conversation, asking questions, listening to Leonardo's theories and ideas. For Leonardo, who had spent so much of his life trying to convince patrons to support his work, who had so often been dismissed or undervalued, this unqualified admiration from a powerful king must have been deeply gratifying. Francis reportedly called Leonardo his father, and there is every indication that he meant it. Here, finally, was someone who appreciated Leonardo not for what he could produce, but for who he was. Leonardo's final years were not particularly productive in terms of completed work. His hand was too weak for sustained painting. He made drawings. He wrote in his notebooks. He continued to think and observe and question. He organized some of his older manuscripts, perhaps with the idea of eventually publishing them, though this never happened. He received visitors, dignitaries, and scholars who came to meet the legendary Leonardo da Vinci. He designed costumes and sets for court festivals. He walked in the gardens, observing the play of light on leaves, the movement of water in the fountains, storing away observations even though he knew he would never use them. In his notebooks from this period, there is a sense of summing up, of reflecting on a life spent in pursuit of knowledge. He wrote about the nature of painting, defending it as the highest of the arts because it engaged both the eye and the mind, because it required understanding of everything from mathematics to anatomy to psychology. He wrote about the importance of observation, of learning from nature rather than from books. He wrote about the interconnectedness of all things, about how understanding one aspect of the world illuminated all others. These were the insights of a lifetime, the wisdom accumulated through decades of relentless curiosity. He also seemed at peace with his failures. The unfinished projects, the abandoned commissions, the gap between vision and execution that had haunted him, none of this seemed to trouble him now. He had done what he could. He had pursued knowledge for its own sake, had asked questions, had tried to understand. If the world had not always appreciated his efforts, if patrons had been disappointed, if critics complained about unfinished paintings, well, that was their problem, not his. There is a story, likely apocryphal but beautiful nonetheless, that King Francis was present when Leonardo died, that Leonardo died in the king's arms. Whether or not this is true, it captures something essential about Leonardo's final years. He died valued and honored, if not for specific achievements, then for the totality of his being. He died on May 2nd, 1519, at the age of 67. He was buried in the church of Saint-Florentin in Amboise, though the church was later destroyed and the exact location of his remains is unknown. What Leonardo left behind was not a tidy legacy. There were perhaps 15 paintings that could be definitively attributed to him, several of those unfinished or damaged. There were thousands of pages of notebooks filled with observations and drawings and theories, but unpublished, unsorted, scattered. There were ideas and inventions that would not be realized for centuries. There were anatomical discoveries that would have to be rediscovered by others, There were students and followers who tried to paint in his style, but could never quite capture his genius. But Leonardo also left behind something more fundamental. He left behind a way of seeing, a way of being in the world. He demonstrated that it was possible to refuse to accept boundaries, to insist on following curiosity wherever it led, to treat the entire world as worthy of investigation and wonder. He showed that art and science were not separate domains, but different aspects of the same quest to understand reality. He proved that genius was not just about talent, but about persistence, about asking questions, about the refusal to be satisfied with surface appearances. The Renaissance believed in the ideal of the universal man, the individual who could excel in multiple domains, who embodied the full range of human potential. Leonardo was the supreme embodiment of that ideal. He was painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, anatomist, geologist, botanist, mathematician, musician, philosopher. But he was more than the sum of these roles. He was someone who saw connections where others saw only separate categories, who understood that knowledge was a unified whole, that understanding the flight of birds illuminated the structure of water, which illuminated the design of machines, which illuminated the nature of human anatomy. His influence on art was immediate and lasting. The painters who came after Leonardo, even those who never met him, were shaped by his innovations. His sfumato technique, his use of atmospheric perspective, his understanding of light and shadow, his ability to capture psychological depth in faces, all of these became part of the language of Western painting. When we look at paintings from the 16th century onward, we are seeing through Leonardo's eyes, whether we realize it or not. His influence on science was more delayed but equally profound. His notebooks, which remained largely unknown for centuries after his death, eventually found their way into collections and were studied by scholars. As they were published and analyzed, people began to realize the scope of Leonardo's scientific thinking. Here was a man who had anticipated discoveries in anatomy, in geology, in fluid dynamics, in optics, in countless other fields. He had not had the tools or the theoretical framework to fully develop these insights, but he had asked the right questions, had made observations that would not be made again for hundreds of years. But perhaps Leonardo's most important legacy is the example he set. He showed that it was not necessary to choose between art and science, between beauty and truth, between the useful and the beautiful. He showed that a fully realized human being could embrace all of these, could find joy and meaning in the pursuit of understanding for its own sake. He lived according to his own vision, indifferent to conventional success, willing to leave projects unfinished if they no longer interested him, always moving toward the next question, the next mystery. Think again about that old man in the French manor house, surrounded by his notebooks and his unfinished painting. Think about what he had accomplished and what he had failed to accomplish. He had not built his bronze horse or his flying machine. He had not completed most of his paintings. He had not published his anatomical discoveries or his theories about geology. By conventional measures of success, his life might seem like a series of failures. But Leonardo understood something that his critics did not. The goal was not the completed painting or the published treatise. The goal was understanding itself, the process of investigation, the journey toward truth. Every drawing he made, every dissection he performed, every page he filled with observations and calculations was valuable in itself, regardless of whether it resulted in a finished product. This is why Leonardo remains relevant today, why we still study his notebooks, still marvel at his paintings, still find inspiration in his life. In a world that increasingly values productivity and completion, that wants results and deliverables, Leonardo reminds us that some of the most important work cannot be measured or finished. He reminds us that curiosity is its own justification, that the pursuit of knowledge is worthy even if it leads nowhere practical, that understanding the world is one of the highest human endeavors. He also reminds us of the cost of such dedication. Leonardo never had a settled home after his childhood. He never had a family of his own in any conventional sense. He never had the financial security that a more conventional career might have provided. He spent much of his life moving from place to place, dependent on the whims of patrons, never quite fitting in anywhere. His refusal to compromise, his insistence on following his own path, came at a price. But he paid it willingly, and he never seemed to regret his choices. There is a drawing in one of Leonardo's notebooks, made near the end of his life, of an old man sitting in profile, with a long beard and weary eyes, lost in thought. Many scholars believe this is a self-portrait, Leonardo looking at himself in a mirror, recording what he saw with the same unflinching honesty he brought to everything. If so, it is a remarkable image. There is no vanity in it, no attempt to flatter. It is simply an old man, tired, weathered by life, but still present, still observing. The hand that drew it was weak, the line less steady than in Leonardo's youth, but the intelligence behind the drawing is undiminished. What was Leonardo thinking when he drew this image? Was he reflecting on his life, on what he had done and what he had left undone? Was he observing his own aging as he had observed everything else, with curiosity and detachment? We cannot know. But we can imagine that he looked at his reflection and saw not failure or regret, but a life fully lived, a mind fully engaged, a journey that had taken him to places no one had gone before. Leonardo died 500 years ago, but he is still with us. He is with us every time we question conventional wisdom, every time we look closely at the world and see something others have missed, every time we refuse to accept that there are limits to what we can understand or achieve. He is with us in the paintings that hang in museums, in the notebooks that scholars still study, finding new insights centuries later. He is with us in the example he set, the proof that one human life, fully dedicated to curiosity and understanding, can push the boundaries of what is possible. The young boy wandering the Hills of Vinci, observing water and birds and light. The apprentice in Verrocchio's workshop, learning to see and to create. The court artist in Milan, dreaming of bronze horses and flying machines. The anatomist cutting open bodies in search of truth. The painter spending years on a single portrait, trying to capture something that could never quite be captured. The old man in France, his hand paralyzed, his notebooks piled around him, still asking questions, still observing, still refusing to accept the world as it appeared. All of these are Leonardo, and all of them are part of why he matters, why his life continues to inspire and challenge us. So when we stand in front of the Mona Lisa, when we study Leonardo's anatomical drawings, when we marvel at his sketches of flying machines and water systems and grotesque heads and sublime landscapes, we are not just appreciating the work of a talented Renaissance artist. We are encountering a vision of what it means to be fully human, to engage with the world in all its infinite complexity, to refuse to be satisfied with partial answers or conventional wisdom. We are seeing evidence of a mind that never stopped asking, never stopped observing, never stopped trying to understand. And perhaps that is the most important lesson Leonardo has to teach us. Not any specific technique or discovery, not any particular painting or invention, but the example of a life lived in pursuit of truth and beauty and understanding. A life that refused to be contained by social conventions or professional boundaries or practical limitations. A life that looked at the world with wonder and tried, through art and science and sheer stubborn curiosity, to penetrate to its essence. A life that, even after 500 years, still has the power to inspire and challenge and amaze us. That boy born in 1452 in a small Tuscan village, illegitimate, excluded from conventional paths, left to his own devices and his own observations, became Leonardo da Vinci, the man who painted like no one before or since. The man who understood the human body better than the physicians of his age. The man who dreamed of flight centuries before it was possible. The man who saw the world not as a collection of separate things, but as a unified whole, governed by principles that could be understood through patient observation and fearless inquiry. The man who has never been forgotten, who will never be forgotten, because he showed us what the human mind can achieve when it refuses to accept limits.